Welcome to The Explainer. Today, listen, we're not just dusting off some dry ancient history here. We are looking at what is arguably the ultimate 3,000-year underdog story. It's the tale of a deity who started at the absolute rock bottom of the divine corporate ladder and somehow hustled his way right to the very top to become the supreme CEO of the ancient Mesopotamian universe. We're talking, of course, about the Babylonian god Marduk.
So you really have to ask yourself, how does a nobody god, a guy barely even mentioned in the early historical records, become king of the entire universe? I mean, it's a serious question. Because what we're about to look at today isn't just a story about religion, it's honestly the most successful political campaign in mythological history.
Okay, let's dive into this. Just look at Marduk's insanely humble resume back in the 3rd millennium BC. He was this obscure, hyper-local deity for a completely unimportant little town called Babylon. Scholars actually think his original roles were incredibly niche, like maybe a minor god hanging out in the underworld or just a local guy in charge of canals, agriculture, and muddy seasonal floods. I mean, his divine symbol was literally a shade, a shovel. But fast forward to the 1st millennium BC, boom! He is the undisputed king of the gods. He's the creator of the cosmos, the creator of mankind, the master of magic, and astrologically, he's tied to the massive planet Jupiter. Now that is quite the promotion.
Right. So how does someone get a promotion that massive? Well, it all comes down to human geopolitics. Marduk's incredible, rocketing rise was entirely tied to the geopolitical power of his sponsor city, Babylon. You see, in ancient Mesopotamia, a god's status directly mirrored the military and political muscle of the people worshipping them. So, as Babylon grew from this minor little settlement into a terrifying imperial powerhouse, Marduk's resume had to be artificially inflated to match the city's massive new ego.
Just look at the sheer scale of this hustle across 4 distinct eras. Back in the 3rd millennium BC, he's barely a footnote. Then, during the Old Babylonian period, under heavy hitters like King Hammurabi, he's a rising star. You start seeing his name pop up in legal oaths and local sanctuaries. By the time we hit the Kassite period, he's a serious contender. Over 10% of the population has names with Marduk in them, and his cult is locked in. And finally, by the 1st millennium BC, he is the undisputed supreme king. He literally had to grind for 2,000 years to finally reach the top.
Now, what's really interesting about this is the exact strategy Babylon used to pull this off. It's a concept called syncretism. Think of it as ancient mythological mergers and acquisitions. Whenever Babylon conquered or absorbed some new territory, Marduk would literally absorb the resumes, the titles, and the powers of that territory's established gods. He wasn't just defeating rival gods, he was acquiring their whole portfolios.
A perfect example of this corporate takeover goes down during the Old Babylonian period. Marduk needed a better pedigree, right? So Babylon orchestrates this brilliant strategic merger with a god named Asaluhi. Now, Asaluhi was the highly respected god of incantations from the ancient prestigious city of Eridu. And crucially, he was the son of the great water god, Ea. So through syncretism, Marduk just absorbs Asaluhi's identity. Overnight, Marduk is declared the son of Ea, which suddenly gives our rising star serious magical credibility and a highly respectable divine family tree.
Which brings us to their formal 3-step takeover strategy. Identify regional powers, absorb their attributes, and then rebrand as the supreme authority. And they were absolutely audacious about this. By the İNAL II period, Babylon literally swapped their city wall names with the holy city of Nippur. Now, Nippur was the seat of the former supreme god, Enlil. So by giving Babylon's walls Enlil's sacred names and giving Nippur's walls Marduk's names, the Babylonians were effectively putting it in stone. Marduk wasn't just a replacement, he was the exact, undeniable equal to the former supreme boss.
But, to truly solidify a corporate takeover of this magnitude, you need more than just swapping some names on a wall. You need the ultimate PR campaign. And that brings us right into the 1st millennium BC and the creation of the Enūma Elish. Now, we usually read this today as a religious text or a cool creation myth, but in reality, it functions as a brilliant piece of state-sponsored propaganda, specifically designed from the ground up to justify Marduk's final promotion to the absolute top.
Let's break this manifesto down, because it's wild. The epic tells this story where the older generation of gods is facing a terrifying chaos monster named Tiamat. And while all the old management cowers in fear, young Marduk steps up. He volunteers to fight when no one else will. He defeats Tiamat and then literally builds the world out of her corpse, establishing Babylon at the very center of the entire cosmos. And here's the best part. Enlil, the old supreme god? He is conspicuously ignored throughout the entire epic. He is completely sidelined. This manifesto positioned Marduk as the sole savior and the only rightful ruler of the universe.
So the absolutely crucial point here comes down to one single number, 50. In Mesopotamian theology, 50 was the sacred, defining number of that old supreme god Enlil. At the very climax of the Enuma Elish, after Marduk has saved the universe, the other gods gather around and grant him 50 names. They are literally handing him Enlil's sacred number and all of his titles. I mean, it was the ultimate divine mic drop.
But hey, being at the very top makes you a target, right? Because Marduk was now the literal physical source of Babylon's power. Residing as a physical wooden statue in his massive temple, the Esagila, he became a huge target for rival empires. And this ushers in a totally fascinating high-stakes era of geopolitics that we can basically call godnapping.
You can really see the sheer scale of these ancient geopolitical squabbles here. Rival kings figured out pretty quickly that if you want to cripple Babylon's morale, you don't just beat their army on the field, you steal their divine CEO. You had the Hittite king Marduk I raiding Babylon and swiping the statue. Later on, the Assyrian king Tukulti-Ninurta I lugs the statue off to Assyria. In 1155 BC, the Alarmites abduct the statue yet again, which actually triggered this legendary movie-style rescue mission by the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar I. Stealing that statue was the ultimate geopolitical flex.
But the absolute most extreme example of this political religious warfare has to be the Assyrian king Sennacherib. Around 689 BCE, Sennacherib grew so incredibly frustrated with these constant, endless Babylonian revolts that he didn't just steal the statue this time, he destroyed the city of Babylon entirely, leveled it. And he didn't stop at physical destruction either. He attempted a massive religious reform to completely replace Marduk with the Assyrian god Ashur, literally rewriting the ancient text to erase Marduk's supremacy.
And this brilliantly illustrates just how deeply intertwined religion and state power really were back then. The Assyrians created a text that scholars now call the Marduk ordeal. They took the joyous traditional Babylonian Akitu festival and completely reinterpreted its rituals as a humiliating trial. In this Assyrian version, Marduk isn't a triumphant king at all. He's held captive. The red on his ceremonial clothes, they declared that to be his blood. He is put on trial before the Assyrian god Ashur and subjected to a literal river ordeal for his quote-unquote crimes. They completely rewrote the theology to match the political reality of Assyrian dominance.
But of course, this brutal back and forth definitely wasn't one-sided. When the political winds shifted, so did the theology. Babylonian kings would later use Marduk's divine wrath as the ultimate justification for their own devastating counterattacks. When King Nabonassar finally struck back, he proudly claimed he was killing the Assyrian and laying waste to his lands by the command of Marduk. The god's terrifying geopolitical wrath essentially became the engine for Babylonian imperialism.
So you kind of have to wonder, what is the cultural impact of living under a deity this incredibly complex and heavily politicized? Imagine being an everyday Babylonian. How on earth do you reconcile living under a god whose immense power dictates brutal imperial wars with your very real everyday need for a personal protector and a healer?
Well, that exact tension is captured beautifully in a famous text known as the Ludlul Bel Nemeki, often referred to as the Babylonian Job. The narrator of this poem suffers terribly, and he believes Marduk's unpredictable anger has caused all his illnesses and ruined his life, crying out that nobody understood the actions of the gods. Yet the text resolves with a young woman appearing in a dream to announce his suffering has finally ended. So despite Marduk's savage mood swings on the grand geopolitical stage, his ultimate brand identity to his actual everyday followers was firmly built on mercy, benevolence, and miraculous healing.
By the time we hit the late Babylonian period, this ancient corporate takeover was completely finalized. Marduk had achieved the ultimate monopoly. We actually have a late god list from this era that essentially identifies almost all the other major gods as merely different aspects of Marduk himself. Think about that. The sun god Shamash, he was simply Marduk of justice. The warrior god Ninurta, just Marduk of the pickaxe. He hadn't just defeated his rivals anymore, he had literally absorbed everyone.
Which leaves us with a totally fascinating question to wrap up this explainer. If a god's power is built entirely on the rise of a specific empire, through all this syncretism, political maneuvering, and state-sponsored PR, what happens to that divine CEO when the empire finally falls? As Babylon eventually gave way to the Persians, the Greeks, and beyond, Marduk's absolute monopoly slowly faded. It's just a powerful reminder that gods often evolve exactly as their people evolve, and our human history forever shapes the heavens above. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive into the source material, and keep questioning the history behind the myths.